You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi everyone, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. In this episode, I want to share with you a very interesting idea about getting outside your cultural bubble, especially if you've been to university. I personally spent a long time in university. I did an undergraduate degree, a master's degree, and a PhD. And it's a well-known idea that one of the things about university is that it's very isolating culturally. In the UK, it's called the ivory tower of university. But this is not just a UK phenomenon, this is worldwide, that there tends to be something that goes on with college where people who go to college become quite insular and isolated in their outlook. I think it was Carl Rogers, the psychologist that I read many years ago in a book of his. He said something along the lines of that the real purpose of university is to create a social club for the people who go to university that they then carry on into the rest of their life. And it's certainly true that there is a kind of cultural bubble that people who are very educated and intelligent tend to live in. And I saw a very interesting interview recently with an author called Charles Murray, who's written a book called Coming Apart, which is about class distinctions in America. I haven't read this book, but he made a very interesting argument in the book that I thought is relevant for this question of the cultural bubble of people who go to university. Basically, Charles Murray's argument is that there's now a very efficient mechanism in universities for separating out intelligent people and putting them in powerful positions within society. So whereas 200 years ago, if you were very intelligent, you'd just be working in the field next to another guy next to you who isn't very intelligent. And the fact that you're very intelligent wouldn't have made that much of a difference to your life. But today, in an advanced industrial society, if you are intelligent, then you can go to university, tick all the boxes in university and get filtered out towards one of the high-paying professions or positions of power within the bureaucracy or one of these other places where intelligent people end up kind of being concentrated. And Charles Murray in this interview was making the argument that the problem with that is that when intelligent people go to university and socialize with each other and then go on and work in the same kind of professions and stuff, they surround themselves with each other, they live in the same places, they do the same things, they have the same kind of jobs, and they basically are completely out of touch with the rest of society, the rest of the working population, people who are doing different things who aren't in their little cultural bubble. So he had some interesting questions that he likes to ask his readers to see whether or not they are in a cultural bubble. Because Charles Murray in this interview was saying that even though he's describing this cultural bubble phenomenon, the people who read his books are intelligent people who've been to university, and they are exactly the kind of people who get culturally isolated like this and become ignorant of the rest of society as a part of that. And, you know, I'm also somebody who went to university. I spent ages in university. And so it's interesting for me to think about this question of, well, how culturally isolated have I made myself? And what can I learn about that to broaden my horizons and make sure that I'm not ignorant about things that are important in life? And also, I'm interested in this question because I'm a parent now, and I want to make sure that my daughter has the freedom to choose her own path in life and not to have her views skewed by being constrained inside a little cultural bubble. Let me share with you some of the questions that Charles Murray asks that I think are really interesting to determine whether you have become culturally isolated. So I'm just going to select some of the interesting questions out of this. I'm not going to go through every single one, but I'm going to select some interesting questions that I think gave me pause to think about. So here's the first question. Did you grow up in a family in which the chief breadwinner was not in a managerial job or a high-prestige profession, defined as attorney, physician, dentist, architect, engineer, scientist, or college professor? And he has a scoring system, which I won't bother going into the details of, but the idea is that if the chief breadwinner for most of your childhood was in what you consider to be a blue-collar job, then that's least bubble-like. But of course, if you had parents who were in one of these professional jobs, that's most part of this cultural bubble. And the reason he asked the question is because the percentage of households in which the chief breadwinner was not in a managerial job or a high prestige profession ranged from 85% in 1960 to 75% in 2010. So the idea being is that most families are not managerial, but the college-educated elite tend to all cluster in these professions. And it's certainly true, for example, for my family. My mother was a teacher and my father was an architect. Next question. During the last year, have you ever purchased domestic mass market beer to stock your own fridge? And he mentions that the leading qualifying beers are Budweiser, Coors, Miller, or Busch Light or regular. The reason that Charles Murray gives for this question is the disdain of the new upper class for domestic mass market beer is nearly as intense as its disdain for people who smoke cigarettes. I have certainly seen this. College-educated people want craft beers and so forth, and generally have disdain for mass market beers. Now, I don't drink alcohol anymore, so this doesn't apply to me, but I definitely know what he's talking about. Next question. Have you ever lived for at least a year in an American neighborhood in which the majority of your 50 nearest neighbors did not have college degrees? And his reasoning behind this question is, in the 2000 census, 92% of Americans lived in zip codes in which the majority of adults aged 25 or older did not have college degrees. So the idea is that although most areas are not college degree dominated, people who go to university then all tend to go and live in the same places. They live in the same neighborhoods. And he mentions, by the way, that choosing a gentrifying neighborhood with a bunch of artsy college graduates doesn't count either. He's talking about whether or not you live in a regular neighborhood that is predominantly non-college. This is true for me. I have lived in neighborhoods that are not dominated by college graduates, partly because I have an unusual upbringing in that I spent a lot of my childhood living in a squat in an area, in quite a poor area. So I have that, but I've also lived all over the place. So this doesn't apply to me, but I think it's a very interesting question. And I also remember that the book, The Millionaire Next Door, made a similar point about choosing where to live. Basically, the author, Thomas Stanley, argued that one really important strategy of millionaires next door, that is frugal millionaires, is that they basically choose to buy a place in a regular neighborhood, not in one of the little cultural bubble type neighborhoods that Charles Murray is talking about in this questionnaire. Another interesting question that he asks is, have you ever walked on a factory floor? And he writes, I was prompted to use this question because of personal experience. In the mid-1980s, my sponsor for a speech at a local college was the owner of a factory that makes cardboard boxes, and my host took me to see it. It was fascinating. The ingenious machines, the noise, the speed, the organization. Then it struck me that every product I used was made in such a place, in the aggregate thousands of them, constituting the world that made my life possible. And until then, I had never seen even a glimpse of it, except as a small child on a single visit to Maytag's company assembly line. My visit to the box factory was a quarter of a century ago, and I haven't been to another factory since. This is certainly true for me. As it happens, I have never walked a factory floor. And it gave me pause thinking about that, especially as Charles Murray says in this, because of all the things that are made in factories. That question also made me think about my role as a parent and the kind of things that I can show to my daughter. So, for example, I want to find a factory floor to take her around. I think that would be an interesting thing to do. I'd love to do it anyway, but I think it would be useful for her to see that. Another question that he asks is, have you ever held a job that caused something to hurt at the end of the day? He says, this question applies to any part of the body that hurts because of physical labor using large muscles. Headaches don't count, and neither does carpal tunnel syndrome. If you answered no to this one, your bubble is thick indeed. I have had those kind of jobs, both growing up when I worked stacking shelves and also in my adult life because I used to do pedestrian movement consulting. I also used to do pedestrian surveys and stand around on streets all day long. But I think it's a really interesting question too. And I should imagine that there's probably quite a lot of university graduates who don't ever do physical labor and don't ever see that kind of work. He has a bunch of other questions which I thought were interesting, but I won't go into them because it could get too long. But I just thought it was really interesting food for thought to think about the cultural bubble that you get from going to university and how that kind of sticks with you and how it can turn you into kind of an ignorant person of a lot of really important parts of life. I've talked in the past about the things that you don't learn in school about entrepreneurship and personal finance, but I think it's also true that in school and college and university, there's just vast parts of working life that you don't see and you don't have any insight into. And the worst thing about it is that intelligent people, college graduates, also enjoy separating themselves culturally. There's a kind of snobbery that happens that I think it's important to be aware of if you want to choose your own path in life and not just do what the people around you are doing. For example, that question that Charles Murray asked about whether or not you have mass market beers in your fridge, I think that's the kind of example that, in a way, that kind of thing gets used as a cultural signifier that college graduates tend to want to show, look, I'm not just like the mass market people. I'm special. I'm different. I make choices that show, cultural choices that show I'm different. And there's kind of an arrogance and an ego involved in that intelligent people like to think of themselves as better than everyone else. And this can actually really influence their own culture, the culture of intelligent people and college graduates. For example, I read an interesting article about modern literature in the 20th century that became so weird and in many ways so unreadable. And the argument in this article about why modern novels became so unreadable was because they were deliberately trying to exclude mass readers. So in the 19th century, suddenly the literacy really expanded and Western countries became basically fully literate. And this was happening all through the 19th century. Everyone was learning how to read, and reading was becoming very popular. And so the masses were reading Shakespeare and stuff like that. People were actually picking up great books of literature, and they became popular texts. And so what happened was that the intelligentsia wanted to then separate themselves out. They didn't want to be reading the same things as all of the, regular people. So they started getting into books that were so hard to read. I'm thinking about James Joyce's Ulysses and stuff like that, that it kind of set them apart. It was like a cultural signifier. Look how special I am. Look how different I am. I think independent cinema is often like that too. Educated people don't want to watch the same movies as everyone else. They want their own special movies. So they watch art house cinema, which often is just unwatchable. But the part of it being unwatchable is it's deliberately weeding out the majority of people who might want to watch it, but in order to be exclusive. That's the whole idea. But what that cultural elitism misses is a fundamental thing that kind of brings us all together in modern industrial societies, and that is that there is a force in modern economies towards mass consumption. What happens is that everything starts out, new consumer products start out as luxuries, but in order for the entrepreneurs who make those new products to make money, what they do is they try and scale them and they try and appeal to a larger and larger market until everyone has them. So, mobile phones start out as an incredible luxury and now everybody has them. And that's actually a culturally unifying force. That means that we all end up having access to the same things. And that's not to say you can't choose your own, unique blend of things that you like. But I think it's really important to bear in mind that this attempt to culturally isolate yourself in many ways is kind of backward thinking. It's a kind of leftover snobbery that a lot of university-educated people have. And I think it's really worth questioning to what extent you are living in a cultural bubble. Of course, I also want to say it doesn't mean you have to like everything that is produced in the culture. There's lots of mass market stuff that I just don't like and I think is kind of stupid and wouldn't appeal to me personally. So it's not to say you have to enjoy all the cultural products that are out there. But I think some of the things in this questionnaire that I've talked about, like actually knowing how things work, knowing what it's like to work in jobs that are not professional jobs, knowing what it is like to be in places where the products that you use are produced, and understanding how the world works around you, that I think is really valuable. And that's what I hope to be able to ensure that my kids learn, because they won't learn it in university for sure. And that's where I think you have to try and be conscious of what you don't learn in college and broaden your horizons outside it and not live in a cultural bubble. The other thing that intelligent people who've been to university tend to do is they tend to conflate the idea of being intelligent with the idea of being good or virtuous. And they're not the same thing. There are good, virtuous people who are also intelligent, and there are good, virtuous people who are not intelligent. And there are also bad or not virtuous people who are intelligent and bad people who are not that intelligent. So I think it's really important to see that distinction and not conflate the two. And that's something that I really hope to be able to show my daughter as well, that there are people who work in all areas of life, some of which she might not want to work in herself, but she can still respect them as decent people. And there are also people who work in positions that she might aspire to that kind of work, but she might also see that some of the people who work in those positions are not good people. I hope you found that interesting. That's all for this week's episode. I'll be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, I hope you have a great week.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you like this podcast, please show your support by becoming a patron of The Voluntary Life on Patreon. Your support will help to grow and improve the show, and you'll get access to a treasure trove of rewards, including bonus episodes. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to learn more.